Are you looking for some of the best books about Spain? This episode is for you. I've been pretty much an obsessive reader since I was in kindergarten, and since moving to Spain more than 20 years ago, I've done plenty of reading about it. So today we're going to talk about some of my favorite books, which you might like as well. There's also some books that I have read but don't really recommend. They are popular, and perhaps you could enjoy those if you were so inclined. This list was originally inspired by an article that caught my interest a while ago. It was a list of the best books about Spain, and I felt a little bit bad because I had only read one of them. That was The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. However, I guess my taste in books is a bit off the beaten path, as you might say, a bit less mainstream. So I'm going to talk about some of the less mainstream books that you could read about Spain. If you're into the very popular, then there's always things like The Shadow of the Wind, which I tried to read and absolutely hated. Your mileage may vary. Also, The Alchemist allegedly is about Spain. I read that a long time ago and don't remember anything very specifically about Spain. It seemed to be largely a work of imagination. Anyway, you could read that if you were into that sort of thing. The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. Always an option. Hey everybody, it's Daniel. Welcome back to Spain to Go, the best podcast in the entire multiverse for all things Spain. This is episode 107. I am coming to you from beautiful Barcelona. Shout out today to Pope Francis, who died yesterday. Spain is a Catholic country, not officially anymore. The Constitution describes Spain as a secular country these days, but there is a long Catholic tradition. I am not officially a Catholic, but I respect the tradition. However, I'm not sure if I have anything interesting or intelligent to say about Pope Francis. The government declared 3 days of official mourning. I don't really expect that to have any impact on my life. I have been through a couple of papal transitions in my time in Spain, and they're usually pretty uneventful. However, if anything interesting does happen, of course, you can find all the best information about life in Spain right here on this podcast. I will keep you informed to the best of my ability. Having given a shout out to the Pope, I would also like to give a shout out to Tyler. Tyler wrote to me on Instagram saying, "Been crushing your pods since I found you last week." I assume that means he has been listening to every episode of my podcast. Been crushing your pods. Tyler continues, "Enjoying them in preparation for our family of 4 trip to Andalusia at the end of May. We are from southeastern US and can't wait to get out of here, if only for 10 days. Keep it up. Great content." Thank you, Tyler. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it. A lot of people are hoping to get out of the US these days. I've got some stuff about that if you're into it. Check the list here. I had an article and podcast the other day about, is Spain overrated? Is Spain overrated? Well, maybe it is. I talk about some of the difficulties of expat life, which are not usually portrayed on Instagram. There are also a couple of episodes about moving abroad and integrating in Spain. You can just check out the listing of podcast episodes wherever you are. If you enjoy and would like to support this podcast, please go over to expatmadrid.com/donate and send me a donation. Anything from €3 to however much you want is much appreciated. expatmadrid.com/donate. I will give you a shout out in the prestigious before episode slot here. Thank you very much to all my present and previous donors. That is expatmadrid.com/donate. So let's talk about books. Spain has had a certain literary appeal for English speakers since at least the time of Lord Byron. Ernest Hemingway is just one in a long line of Brits and Americans who came to Spain and found their literary inspiration in the hot Iberian sun. Hemingway's debut novel, The Sun Also Rises, is a bullfighting book, originally published in 1926. I think I first read it in high school because I was going to be tested on theme or symbolism, and that book had a lot of it. Spanish people would sometimes complain back in the day about Americans moving to Spain and having some obsession with Ernest Hemingway. I was never super obsessed with Hemingway, but it is a thing. There are definitely bars that claim Hemingway drank here, and if you're a young guy who's into literature and into booze, you might spend more than your fair share of time in bars where Hemingway may have once drunk something. In any case, Hemingway sounds a bit old-timey these days, but I would like to mention that Pamplona, the city, would probably be much less known if it weren't for Ernest Hemingway. He pretty much put it on the map with this book, The Sun Also Rises, at least the international map. There are Running of the Bulls type festivals in a lot of Spanish cities and towns, and Pamplona is just one of them. So the city of Pamplona owes a lot to Ernest Hemingway. Probably Restaurante Botín in Madrid would be less known also if it weren't for Hemingway. At the end of The Sun Also Rises, Big Papa, that's Hemingway's nickname from back in the day in case you're not a fan, Big Papa mentions Botín and their suckling pig, which you should definitely try if you're in Madrid and you've got the money. That is Restaurante Botín. It's known as the world's oldest restaurant. Their oven has allegedly been burning for 300 consecutive years. So they've been around for a long time. But Hemingway's recommendations certainly helped. It is also worth mentioning that after I published this as an article out on the blog, expatmadrid.com, I got a comment from Ignaz. Ignaz says, "Hate to break it to you, but Restaurante Botín is far from being the world's oldest restaurant. There are eateries in Japan that have been in the same place for much longer. For example, Honke Owariya is the oldest restaurant in Japan, founded in 1465. I looked this up. There is a place called Owariya on Wikipedia that allegedly has been in the same place since 1465. Wikipedia also suggests that Restaurante Botín's thing, where it's been around for 300 years, is a myth, that it's been around since about 1865 or something like that. It is possible that I have fallen into some clever propaganda by, I don't know, the Eurocentric Guinness Book of World Records or something. If you Google world's oldest restaurant, you just may get a full page of results pointing you to Restaurante Botín. That's what happened to me, and I just always assumed that that was true. Anyway, if it's not true, I apologize to whoever owns the actual oldest restaurant in the world, possibly the soba noodle place in Kyoto. Thank you, Ignaz, for clearing this up for me, or, well, further confusing me, actually. Thank you, Ignaz, for commenting. I appreciate it. Let's talk about more books that you might enjoy about Spain. First, Ghosts of Spain by Giles Tremlett. I was worried that Ghosts of Spain would end up being another boring Spanish history book. You know the type, starting with the cavemen up in Altamira with their famous cave paintings, and moving on to the Phoenicians in 800 BC, etc. Well, Ghosts of Spain is nothing like that. It actually starts with the laws about historical memory passed around 30 years after the end of Franco's dictatorship, when people started digging up the bodies of their family members who had been left in mass graves. It goes on to talk quite a bit about modern Spain, the legacy of Franco, the transition to democracy, a lot of stuff that Spanish people talk about from time to time, but that's a bit puzzling to an outsider if you don't already know the story. Giles Tremlett has a few other books, but I haven't read them. Ghosts of Spain, though, is really good. By the way, if you want to support this podcast in some other way, you can go to my website, expatmadrid.com, and click on some of my links to Amazon. These books are on Amazon, and you can buy them on Amazon if you so choose. If you click on a link on my website and buy it, I may get a small affiliate commission. I'm talking really small, but if you're going to buy stuff anyway, find an Amazon link on my blog and buy it through that. Let's move on to the second book on my list, La Colmena by Camilo José Cela. La Colmena is about poverty and society in post-war Madrid, post-Civil War Madrid in the 1940s. It's one of those hyper-realistic novels that takes place over a few cold days in January at some point in the 1940s. You can still visit some of the places mentioned. It revolves around a cafe that's a lot like Café Comercial in Glorieta de Bilbao. The author, Camilo José Cela, received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1989. By the way, this book is in English. It's called The Hive. The Hive, like a beehive. That is what a colmena is. Cela is spelled C-E-L-A, so just look for The Hive by Cela and you should find it. Anyway, Cela received the Nobel Prize in Literature for 1989, and I liked this book when I read it a long time ago. It's a classic, and it gives you an idea of what Madrid was like in the post-Civil War period. No picnic. On the other hand, a lot of left-leaning Spanish literary types aren't big fans of Cela because he later came out, or better yet, later was revealed to have been a spy for Franco during the 60s. He was kind of telling the authorities during the dictatorship about which literary types may have had communist sympathies or something like that. You can check out an article about it. There's an article on The Guardian about Cela spying for Franco. The title of the article is what? Spanish novelist spied for Franco's regime is the title. You could just Google Spanish novelist spied for Franco's regime and probably figure that out. The article is 20 years old. The controversy is even older, but could be an interesting thing to look into if you're that kind of person. The novel is in English as The Hive, as I say, but I don't know if Cela has actually ever been popular in the English-speaking world. The list of Nobel Prize-winning authors is often sort of a who's who of people I've never heard of. I only hear about them when they receive the Nobel and then never again. Moving on to another one, let's talk about Feria by Ana Iris Simon. I liked Feria quite a bit. This novel was written with low expectations from what I've heard. Ana Iris Simon was just a young woman from a small town in La Mancha. She wrote a book about her town and her family, and it became a surprise hit. A surprise hit in unexpected ways. Ana Iris Simon is from Campo de Criptana, a town that I visited actually on my bike tour of La Mancha. You can hear about that in one of my previous episodes. The episode is called Route of Don Quixote Bike Tour. It's episode 76 of this podcast. I enjoyed that quite a bit. Episode 76, and of course, go to biketourinspain.com for all of your bike touring needs. When I was down in La Mancha, I kept thinking about Ana Iris Simon in this book because she talks about small towns in this area. She talks about the wind and the hilltops and just the scenery and the type of people who live there in a way that is not at all dismissive. And since everything is political these days, some Spanish political figures, actually on the right, picked this book up and started talking about it because it doesn't dismiss the small town values. It talks about them as something that we should, cherish. She talks about church and her family and, normal stuff that everybody from, the 1990s cared about and that now is less popular. So Ana Iris Simon is about as leftist as a person could possibly be, but the book was picked up by some right-wing figures, and now she's sort of a political pundit of sorts. She's been writing a column for El País newspaper, which is a very high-level, accomplishment for literary/political type people in Spain, and it's interesting because, she's just some girl from some town. As a person from the middle of nowhere myself, I have a lot of thoughts about this because I actually understand the dynamic. You can move to the big city, but if you write about where you're from without denouncing the backwardness or apologizing to the elitists in every sentence, you will eventually be branded far right by people who have never been out of their little bubble. Believe me, I've been there. I'm from Arizona, literally from the middle of the desert in the southwest US, and some things I have written have been misconstrued as being statements about political leanings that I do not even have just because, Arizona. Because of who I am and because of where I'm from, I've been kind of, branded as being one thing or another, when really I consider myself to be a card-carrying member of the exhausted majority of people who would rather not make everything about politics. Anyway, I liked the book Feria a lot. It's about the transition of Spain from sort of the old-timey, dusty backwater to the modern European, economic powerhouse, quote unquote, that it is now, and it's quite good. Unfortunately, I don't think the book has been translated to English yet. There was an article in the New York Times about Ana Iris Simon and the book, but I don't think the translation has been released yet. Maybe soon. Let's talk about Leaving Atocha Station by Ben Lerner. I only kind of liked this book, but it is certainly popular, so it is worth mentioning here. Ben Lerner was on a Fulbright scholarship in Madrid just a year or two before I showed up. The novel is about a stand-in character, but it's understood to be autobiographical. So here's the deal. The narrator, Adam, writes poetry or pretends to write poetry because of his scholarship. He also spends a lot of time smoking weed, shagging his Spanish teacher, and generally being fairly neurotic. From time to time, he goes to fabulous parties at rich people's houses where he cries in public to get attention from cute girls. Then, somehow people decide he's a brilliant visionary genius for objecting to George Bush's war in Iraq, or something to that effect. It's been a while since I read the full thing. The ending is even douchier, but I have a certain affection for this Ben Lerner kid because I recognize the type. If I had been born to rich parents and then been encouraged to sit around having feelings rather than earning a living, I could have probably ended up as some sort of, self-involved whiner. It sounds like I'm being very harsh here, and I am, but I reread the first chapter of Leaving Atocha Station over the weekend, and I liked it even less than the first time. It starts out well, but by the end of the first chapter, I'm just sick of the guy. In real life, Lerner gives interviews about his white male rage, whatever that means, and like I said, Leaving the Atocha Station is popular, but not really my sort of thing. So let's move on. Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. I'm not sure I really recommend that you read Don Quixote, full Spanish title, El ingenioso hidalgo Don Quixote de la Mancha, but you should probably have a look at the Wikipedia page and get a summary, or you could read my article or listen to my podcast about the root of Don Quixote, episode 76. Got a lot of Don Quixote-related content in there. In any case, I read Don Quixote back in about 2005. They were celebrating the 400th anniversary of the publication of Volume 1 at that point, and I got a new English translation. It wasn't bad, and I've tried rereading some of it since in Spanish. The Spanish is difficult, but Cervantes was definitely a genius. His style is just incredible. Like I said, I give a lot of information about the book, about Cervantes, and, what I enjoyed about it in the Root of Don Quixote episode, which is episode 76. Still, life is short, and if you don't have time for 900 pages of the wacky adventures of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, I completely understand. It's a lot to get through. Moving on. La Voz Dormida by Dulce Chacón. This is one of my personal favorite books about Spain, La Voz Dormida, translated into English as The Sleeping Voice by Dulce Chacón, Chacon. This is maybe the best Spanish language novel I've ever read. I don't know, I've read a lot of books, so it's a tough call, but this one is really good. Maybe I just read it at the right moment in my life to appreciate these kinds of things. Anyway, it is about the resistance to the dictatorship, also after the Spanish Civil War. At that time, a lot of families had people in prison, a lot of leftists went into exile, and there were a few people up in the mountains trying to carry on the Civil War even though it had officially been lost years before. The book is also a pretty good love story. Unfortunately, the author died shortly after writing it, so she doesn't have any follow-up novels. Check it out, though. I liked it a lot. La Voz Dormida, The Sleeping Voice. I actually gave my copy of this book to a girl I was hoping to date back in the 2010s. I never saw the girl again, and I never saw the book again, but I hope she enjoyed it. Most of these books, by the way, would be available in any reasonably sized bookshop in Spain if you happen to already be here. Let's talk about The Battle for Spain by Anthony Beevor. The Battle for Spain is about the Spanish Civil War. It's a history of the Spanish Civil War. I think it's about 600 pages long. A friend who is a history teacher told me years ago, don't even bother reading Spanish authors. When they write histories of the Civil War, they are all way too biased. She recommended I start with Hugh Thomas's huge book, The Spanish Civil War, which I have on my shelf but haven't yet read. Spanish translations tend to be a bit longer, so that is popular in its Spanish format also, its Spanish translation, but since the Spanish language is longer than English generally, any translation is 20 or 30% longer in Spanish. I don't know, longer words, longer sentences, etc. So the Hugh Thomas Spanish Civil War book is 2 volumes in Spanish. I originally tried to read that. It was torture because I didn't speak good enough Spanish and I didn't know anything about the geography. So it's all very puzzling. If you don't know where, Extremadura is, then, anything talking about a battle in Extremadura is going to be complicated. So, a bit shorter and a bit easier to read is The Battle for Spain by Anthony Beevor. Beevor, Beevor. The Battle for Spain was fairly easy to get through, and it didn't seem to be terribly biased ideologically. It seems like Beevor is sympathetic with the Spanish Republic, but most of the authors are going to be sympathetic with the Spanish Republic, so that's just the tone of Civil War books in general. Anyway, I enjoyed The Battle for Spain a lot. It gives a good bit of detail, but without being exhaustingly in-depth. The funny thing about Spanish Civil War histories is they also have to give quite a bit of background before actually getting around to 1936, because the setup for the Spanish Civil War really begins in 1492. The causes of the war are very complex and, go back centuries. So you get an introduction to Spanish history generally in the first few chapters of any book about the Civil War. So The Battle for Spain and Thomas's book as well will give you a basic outline of Spanish history leading up to the Second Republic, which is probably easier than reading about every single king for the last 18 centuries. Talking about the Civil War, let's finish strong with George Orwell. Finally, we have Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell. This is also an episode of the podcast. It's episode 37, Homage to Catalonia. Orwell came to Spain to be a war correspondent and ended up joining the fight on the side of the Republic, fighting against fascism. And I read this book for the first time before I came to Spain because it was on the list of some magazine, I think it was Time Magazine or something, published the best nonfiction books of the 20th century. 100 books to read before you die. And this was the top book, the best nonfiction book of the 20th century, according to whatever magazine we are talking about here. So I picked it up and read it, having no idea what I was getting into. I actually thought that it was going to be about catatonics in a mental institution. Catalonia, catatonia, it's kind of complicated. There's a Wikipedia page clarifying other words that sound like Catalonia. If you do not happen to live in Spain, you might not even know that Catalonia exists, as I didn't at the time. So that was the extent of my ignorance about Spain. Just before moving here, I later learned that Catalonia is a region in the northeast of Spain. Long story. Anyway, Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell. Orwell came over as a war correspondent and ended up joining the fight against fascism. The first time I read it, I completely missed the point. And I assume that a lot of people miss the point just like I did, because even though he starts out fighting fascism, he ends up fleeing Spain when the totalitarian left, led by the Stalinists, take over the war effort. Most people, myself included, understand the part where fascism is bad. That seems obvious, right? But then they, or we, completely miss the part where he discovers that leftist totalitarianism can be just as bad or even worse. That is where his novel 1984 came from, and it's quite a topic. Animal Farm also. Animal Farm is a very good book with the layers. If you read it as just a silly story about animals, then it's, just some weird thing. But if you understand a little bit about the Russian Revolution, for example, it is a whole different experience. Anyway, Homage to Catalonia, I recommend that one a lot. And I have a lot to say about the Spanish Civil War. You can check out episode 37 of this podcast. I'm working on a longer article about it, and when I say working, I mean I have it in my drafts folder and I haven't looked at it in 2 years. But there is more about the Spanish Civil War coming at some point. In any case, the idea that I have gotten from reading quite a bit about it is that the myth that it was a bunch of sort of scrappy peasant farmers fighting against international fascism is maybe true about the first several weeks of the war. After that, it devolved into a much more sinister and much more depressing story. So we will talk about that at some point in the future. For now, Homage to Catalonia by Orwell. His descriptions of sitting in a trench covered in fleas and with just a few bullets every day and a rifle that barely worked are classics of literature about Spain, and they give you a pretty good idea of why the Second Republic didn't last long. That's about all I've got for today. I will put the link to the article here in the show notes so that you can look at the blog and, maybe use some of my links to click through to Amazon, or you could just donate at expatmadrid.com/donate. But on the blog, I've got links to Amazon. I also have links to a few projects from some friends. My friend Lauren back in the day started a company called Devour Tours. If you're coming to Spain and want to have a food experience, she has tapas tours and similar things in various cities around Spain. Go to devourtours.com and find more about that, or click the link on my blog, even better, and take a look. Their sister company, Walks Tours, is also linked on my blog, and they're the ones who organize the tours of the Prado Museum before opening hours. I did that last year. It was fantastic. BikeTourinSpain.com, of course, will take care of your bike touring needs. I have done 2 tours with them, Extremadura last November, and then last May I did the Route of Don Quixote. These were both not terribly difficult. Extremadura was more difficult, but also more rewarding. They were both enjoyable experiences, though. BikeTourinSpain.com. Tell Raul that I sent you. I don't get any sort of commission there, but Raul has treated me very well, and his tours are excellent, so I recommend them. BikeTourinSpain.com. I have a YouTube channel. It's called Learn Spanish with Daniel. You could learn Spanish with me on YouTube. That is pretty self-explanatory. Learn Spanish with Daniel. You can follow me on Instagram. Just look for my name. I am easy to find. And for much, much more, head over to expatmadrid.com. Enter your email address when you're there, and you can get my email updates. I send about one a week when I have a new article or podcast. I mean, one a week optimistically, if I have something new every week. Recently, I have had something new every week, but that could change at any moment, given the scheduling difficulties of, running my own business, plus doing this, plus having a life. Anyway, expatmadrid.com for quite a bit more. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you have a great day wherever you are in the world, and hasta la próxima.